So I'd like to welcome everybody here to this episode of Green Left TV, and I'd like to especially welcome our guest, Paul LeBlanc, who is a socialist, a long-time socialist from the United States. He's renowned for having written Lenin and the Revolutionary Party, among a number of other books. He was formerly a member of the US Socialist Workers' Party. More recently, he was a member of the International Socialist Organisation, which has recently dissolved, and a number of other organisations over the years as well, as I understand it. So yeah, please, thanks for being here, Paul.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, we wanted to talk about the current status of US politics, and in particular developments on the left, and I guess what strategy for leftists to pursue in the current situation. The US Democratic primary debates are up and running, and a discussion is opening up about the presidential elections next year. Can you talk about the political context in which this campaign is occurring? Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Well, there are a number of crises in this country and in the world and in this country. And they include various aspects of an economic crisis. The slippage of the United States as a world power. It's still a world power, but less secure in its power than it has been for a very, very long time. The rich are getting richer, but at the expense of the overwhelming majority of people. And there have been there's been stagnation and decline in the quality of life for a majority of the American people, a majority of the working class. And people feel that. There are declining social services, and social services are being cut. There's all of that kind of stuff. People feel that their children's future is going to be worse than their own. Or that it looks like that may be the way it's shaping up. And this is quite a shock to generations of people that had believed in the so-called American dream for a number of decades. So that's one aspect of the reality. There's also climate change, which despite climate deniers, things are changing. And I think that's extremely disconcerting. The world is changing not only in terms of climate and the weather, that kind of thing, but there is growing instability all over the world, growing reaction against a terrible situation for more and more people. And of course, we have probably the very worst president in U.S. history. And he has stirred up bigotry. He's used a fake populism to rally support for himself, but at the expense, again, of large numbers of people. You've got periodic mass shootings from deranged right-wing killers. This is some of the context in which this presidential debate is taking place. And there's a large number of Democratic Party candidates seeming to be vying with each other to face Trump. And we'll be focused later on in the discussion. But that's some of the context. There's another aspect to the context which I think is very important and will also come up. And that is there's been a sort of a slow-moving deep over the past several decades, what I consider to be a radicalization within the American working class, within the population as a whole. And that radicalization is accelerating within the kind of context that I've described. And there are growing, and again, periodic mass actions around various issues, mass protests over the past several years. The Occupy movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Million Women's March, as well as a rise in strikes among teachers and a ferment within sections of the working class. So that's another aspect of the context.
So you mentioned that Trump is possibly the worst president the United States has ever had. I mean, there's obviously going to be a lot of people that are thinking Trump is just so bad that anybody the Democrats put up even if it's like a really conservative figure like Joe Biden, should be supported. Mm-hmm. Now, socialists, on the other hand, have traditionally had this perspective that independence from the Democratic Party is a fundamental principle. So can you explain, I guess, before we get into the current situation, can you explain why it is that even in the face of, deeply conservative and reactionary Republican candidates, socialists have always put forward this idea about political independence and building our own strength?
Yeah. Well, one thing is, unfortunately, not all socialists have put that forward. A relatively small section of the socialist movement, revolutionary socialists, have consistently argued the absolute necessity of political independence of the working class, and arguing for the political independence of the working class from the two major parties, Democrats and Republicans, which are both capitalist parties. There's a couple of aspects to this. Of course, if you're in favor of the working class winning the battle for democracy, as Marx and Engels put it in the Communist Manifesto, the working class, the majority class, taking power and overturning capitalism, it's impossible to do that if you're enmeshed in a capitalist political party. So it's necessary for workers to stand up for themselves, to stand up for their class, to stand up for the genuine interests of the majority of people against the interests of big business profiteers. There's another aspect to this that revolutionary socialists have advanced, and this is in argument with many socialists, members of the Communist Party, Socialist Party in the past, liberals who are left-leaning liberals, who argue you've got to defeat the candidate who's furthest to the right. And generally, over the past half century, that has meant the Republican Party. You've got to oppose the Republican Party, supporting Democratic Party, liberal, Democratic Party centrist, against the more reactionary section of the capitalist class, the most reactionary and conservative and right-wing sectors in the American political scene. You've got to support the Democrats against that. A problem with that is that the Democrats, traditionally, like the Republicans, are not able to actually face in an adequate way, a way that's adequate for the majority of the people, the crises of American capitalism. They are committed to American capitalism. Therefore, they can make all kinds of campaign promises. One of the most inspiring examples of that was President Obama. And especially the first time he was running. He sounded like a radical. He sounded wonderful. Change, hope, it was all going to be great. But in point of fact, he did not have a program. He wasn't committed to facing the power of the big corporations, facing down the power of the big corporations, actually helping to mobilize masses of people to fight for their interests. Instead, he went along with the dynamics of the status quo, continuation of the status quo, and people's lives weren't improved, they got worse. Things have been getting worse over the past several decades, and people whose lives are getting worse, they're looking around for solutions. If there's no solution to the left, because the left is too busy supporting liberals and centrists who favor capitalism, if there's no alternative to the left, they'll be looking to the right. And American politics, in many ways, to a large extent because of that, has shifted to the right. And now we have President Trump. Supporting Joe Biden, Trump is horrible, but Trump isn't the worst there could be. If we're supporting Biden and we're not building a credible, effective left-wing alternative that's in the interests of the American working class, then if Biden gets in, he's going to do what he's going to do, and people are going to get increasingly desperate and look for alternatives, and the alternatives will be even further to the right than they are now. So revolutionary socialists insist on the necessity of building an independent political force in the interests of the working class, and composed of more and more members of the working class fighting for their rights.
We've experienced a similar thing in Australia with our Conservative Liberal Party drifting to the right and the Labor Party not challenging them and drifting further to the right behind them. And that's, obviously it's not the same in Australia as in the United States, but there's a similar dynamic there. There's obviously a
similar. It's not, unfortunately, it's not unique.
Now, my understanding is you've basically put forward an argument that we're now facing a new situation, and not, I guess, to take away from that importance of building an independent socialist movement, but I think, to put it in your words, a spreading and deepening crisis of capitalism, coupled with a widespread phenomenon of open socialists making use of the Democratic Party ballot line in order to help build an explicitly socialist movement. So tell us how you see what this new situation means.
Well, I've already sketched out some of the context, which includes a growing radicalization within the population. And over the past few decades, although it seemed in some ways like things were just inexorably moving to the right, there were increasing numbers of people, young people, but also others, who were reacting in a more left-wing way. And so you had this mass phenomenon of the Occupy movement, which was very powerful, not just on Wall Street, not just in New York City, but all across the country, definitely in Pittsburgh, where I live, and many other cities as well. And the Black Lives Matter movement, and women's struggle, especially when Trump was elected, an almost spontaneous uprising of women, an organization of women and their allies, the Million Women March, as well as a proliferation of strikes among teachers and other workers. So there's been this kind of radicalization that has been taking place. Within that context, Bernie Sanders in particular made a decision. Now, Sanders has traditionally been an independent candidate as the mayor of Burlington, Vermont, as a congressman from that district, and then as a U.S. senator from Vermont. He has traditionally called himself a socialist. He's been an independent of the two parties, although he's been a very moderate socialist, a reformist socialist, but still that's unique, almost unique on the American scene, or has been until recently. But he made a decision, I think, based on the larger radicalization that was taking place, and given the gutlessness and ridiculous inability of the Democratic Party, so-called liberals, to resist the right-wing onslaught, he put forward what for the United States was a very radical social reform program, and he used the term socialism to define what he believed in. And he argued against an economy and a political setup that was run by the billionaires for the billionaires at the expense of the rest of us and so forth. He put forward that perspective using the word socialist, and but he was doing it within the Democratic Party. Now, if he had done this as an independent candidate outside of the Democratic Party, he would have gone the way of various other protest candidates, in my opinion. Ralph Nader, various other good people have not been able to mount a big enough challenge, because there are large numbers of working class people in the United States who are afraid of throwing their vote away on a protest candidate. But what Sanders did was he ran inside the Democratic Party, and within that context, he got an avalanche of support. He did so much better than was anticipated, and it's anticipated also, or it's speculated that it's conceivable, if the Democratic Party leadership wasn't playing dirty pool, that he could have won He could have won the nomination, and then some people at least feel he could have mounted an effective challenge to Trump and defeated Trump in the presidential election. Whether or not that is a realistic scenario of what might have happened, he changed the political dialogue in the political mainstream of the United States, so that large numbers of people were now using the word socialism as in a positive way, in a way that pitted the 99% against the 1%, the majority of us against the billionaires. So that was a significant shift on the American political scene.
Well, I mean, talking about that shift, I mean, like, it is pretty clear when you look at the Democratic primaries, there has been a shift 2016 to 2019, and there's now a lot more progressive or pseudo-progressive candidates that are contesting the Democratic primaries. Do you want to talk about do you believe that contrast still exists, that Bernie Sanders is a standout candidate because of those things you mentioned, or do you think that he is now one of other progressive candidates? Or perhaps could you make some analysis about Bernie Sanders and the other progressive candidates?
Sure. There are several things that happened based on the 2016 campaign. As I said before, socialism became part of the mainstream political dialogue in a way that it hadn't been for many decades. That's one thing. Related to that, there were large numbers of young people mobilizing for the first time in their lives around the Bernie Sanders campaign and around the idea of some kind of socialism. Related to that was the amazing growth out of that of what had been a very moderate and not a very impressive social democratic organizations, left social democratic organization, DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, where it grew from a few thousand paper members, aging paper members, to a membership of 60,000 and 60,000 largely young, vibrant young activists. And among these activists, there were some who were doing what Sanders did, which was running as an open socialist on the Democratic Party ballot line. And in some cases, they started winning elections. A couple of state legislators in Pittsburgh beat longtime machine Democratic Party candidates in the Democratic Party primary, and they're now sitting in the Pennsylvania state legislature. And there's the whole squad, a small squad, but a squad of open socialists who ran on the Democratic Party ballot line, who are now sitting in U.S. Congress. Similar things have happened in various cities, including in Chicago recently. So this is a new phenomenon. And the difference between Sanders and most of the other Democratic Party candidates is that most of the other Democratic Party candidates are aligned with so-called corporate liberals, corporate interests. They do not want to alienate big business. And Sanders doesn't have that point of view. There's another, Elizabeth Warren, who's also relatively radical, but she continues to defend capitalism. Sanders is unique in, at least in some ways, sometimes pointing the finger at capitalism as the source of the problem and talking about something, socialism, as an alternative to that.
So this in some ways gets us to the nub of the discussion, because you have recently argued that openly socialist candidates who have a chance of getting elected, even when running on the Democratic Party ballot line, should receive at least critical support from revolutionary socialists. So can you tell us about your views on that? What kind of support are you thinking about, and what sort of criticisms do you think should be made?
Sure. One thing is, I think this situation that I've described is time limited. That is, you have large numbers of people rallying to candidates least so in any event, the current situation is you've got a number of candidates who are winning in some cases, or at least winning large vote totals, who identify as socialists and who are far more radical, far more to the left than the Democratic Party as a whole. And they are winning a lot of support and generating all kinds of development and consciousness of large numbers of people in the country, and expectations among increasing numbers of people in the country. And I think this is time limited because the leadership of the Democratic Party, which is absolutely in favor of corporate capitalism, imperialism, militarism, the whole package, but capitalism with a human face, with a more human face than Trump's face, they will not tolerate their party being pulled leftward by this group of socialists. And what they will do is come down on these folks real hard, try to corrupt them. And those who are corrupted, there are some who may be corrupted, who will go along with the Democratic Party pro-capitalist leadership. And there are others who won't. But the large numbers of people who are angry, who are increasingly militant, who are increasingly radicalized, who are increasingly thinking, yeah, some kind of socialism, that's what we need, economic democracy, not the capitalist dictatorship of capitalism. Large numbers of people are not going to give up on their hopes and needs who claim to be socialists go over to the other side, or are repressed by the Democratic Party leadership. So that what I anticipate over the next several years is a political break, a significant political break, or at least the possibility of a mass break from the Democratic Party of large numbers of people who are going in a socialist direction. And in this particular moment, I think it makes sense for revolutionary socialists to say, yeah, critical support to socialists running on the Democratic Party ballot line. We're voting for them not because they're Democrats. We're not voting for Democrats in general, but we're voting for socialists. We need socialism. We need socialism as a political force in the United States. And I think that will help to feed into this dynamic of a possible creation of a mass socialist movement and a socialist electoral force, independent socialist electoral force, within the next several years. That's a possibility now. That's new. At the same time, it is essential that this be critical support. The main thing is not to put one's faith in Bernie or AOC and the socialist squad who were elected in Congress. It's the masses of people who are ready to struggle, who are feeling the pain and the hurt and the anger and being mobilized to struggle for their rights. That is the force that is to a certain extent behind these socialist candidates running in the Democratic Party, and we have to be linked to that. But at the same time, every time Bernie Sanders does something right, or AOC or the others do something right, we should support them and say, yes, that's great. And anytime they do something that we think is wrong, we need to say, we think that's wrong. That's not going to help us. I'm in favor of the Green New Deal that will result in a restructuring of the American economy to eliminate joblessness, to eliminate poverty, and to eliminate the pollution and degradation of the environment. But if people putting forward the Green New Deal are also voting for billions of dollars for the military-industrial complex, that hurts the Green New Deal. And we have to say that. And it is not in the interest of the American people or people around the world to have U.S. Military going into various countries to shore up and defend right-wing dictators against the needs of the people. We have to say that. We have to explain that. If any of the socialist candidates in the Democratic Party are taking a different line, a wrong line, we have to frankly say that. We have to persuade the supporters of those candidates. This is a terrible mistake. This is not in our interest. So it may be that Bernie Sanders and some of the other candidates will be persuaded by the mass pressure of their supporters to go in a better direction on some of these issues. But if they don't, then it's still necessary, more necessary than ever, to be critical of them, because that's not going to get us where we need to go. The main thing is not trying to persuade Bernie Sanders or other candidates. The main thing is what's happening in the consciousness, in the beliefs, in the actions of the masses of people who've been drawn to their campaigns and who are being drawn to the perspectives of socialism. And there's a new situation where that may result in a socialist movement. So it's necessary to speak to them in ways that they can understand, be supportive of certain candidates that are going in the right direction up to a point, but to be critical of those candidates when they're veering off in a direction that's not in the interests of the American working class or the principles of socialism and democracy.
One thing that does strike me in this whole discussion about left-wing strategy, the revolutionary left, especially in the imperialist countries, is very familiar with losing. And I think sometimes what we need to do is we need to work out what are the strategies to win. And it's not necessarily a matter of just looking in the history books and looking what socialists have done in the past, but actually trying to work out in the current circumstances what is the strategy that can win. And I guess when you talk about the prospects of a potentially new mass socialist movement, I guess that is the interesting thing, or the inspiring thing about this whole situation. And I think that on the one hand, false hopes aren't going to get you anywhere. On the other hand, if you sort of give up with a pseudo-radical posture of it's all hopeless, that's not going to get you anywhere either. To me, I feel like this is a very hopeful situation. I mean, I think there are a lot of things that are that are very positive and inspiring about the current situation.
Yeah, we live in the worst of times and the best of times. It is a very hopeful situation. It's a very dangerous situation. But I believe, there is a possibility of building a mass socialist movement in my lifetime. And my life ain't going to last that much longer. And a socialist movement that will be capable in the near future, maybe a little after my time, but in the near future, of effectively challenging capitalism in the United States, as well as in other countries, effectively challenging capitalism and winning. And that's what we've got to be reaching for. One of the big differences between our time and the time of Lenin, Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg, Antonio Gramsci, some of the great revolutionary Marxist theorists of the past, is that they lived in a context in which there was a global labor movement that was socialist, that was animated by revolutionary Marxist ideas. There were other ideas contending within the movement, but there was a mass socialist working class movement. That does not exist in the United States. That hasn't existed in the United States or come close to existing in the United States for a very long time. We are facing a period of time now, we're facing a situation within which it may be possible to help bring that into being. And that is a very hopeful thing. And then we're talking about really fighting for socialism, not just protesting against the forces of evil, but challenging and overturning capitalism, building a mass socialist consciousness and mass action around that consciousness. That is a perspective that I think makes sense over the next period of time, over the next 5 and 10 years.
Well, I mean, is there anything else that you would like to say? I mean, your position has been criticised by other socialists, although I think in some ways you've maybe just answered. Well, do you want to talk about the discussion that's opened up since you've put forward this perspective?
Yeah, sure. and there's a ferment within the left. There are lots of people who are my generation. You know, we've been through all kinds of things, and we've read the Marxist classics, and some of these comrades who've been through traumatic expulsions and splits and collapse of hopes that they had for the red 60s or the red 70s or the red 80s, and now they've kind of given up, is my impression. That is, they are not active. But they know the theories, and some of them play a role of commenting on what's happening in the world, what's happening on the left, what's wrong with the left, what's stupid about the left, so forth and so on, but are not engaged in actually trying to help build a left that can win. And for such people who know the various details and nuances, or at least some of the details and nuances of revolutionary theory, the kinds of things I'm saying don't measure up to what Lenin was saying or Luxemburg was saying in their context. But that was a very different context. Revolutionary Marxists, the necessity of the political independence of the working class from the capitalist class. That is fundamental. And for the United States, there has been within the left, the Communist Party and the old Socialist Party in the days of Norman Thomas and Michael Harrington and so on, there has been a commitment to working inside the Democratic Party in a reformist way, in a non-revolutionary way. This is the best we can do. It's better than going further to the right. There were various rationalizations, and some of the comrades see the kind of thing that I'm saying is a new version of that, and I don't think it is. I think it's something quite different. But some of the criticism has come out of those kinds of concerns. There are some people who, and not just older people, some younger people, and I used to be somewhat this way myself. As a revolutionary, there was revolutionary posturing and rhetoric, but not enough thinking of how do we make this real in the actual context that we're facing. And I think some of the criticism comes out of that. I think that some of the people who've been raising criticisms, some of the points that they're making, there's validity to some of the points they're making. There are dangers in working within the Democratic Party. Some of the socialists who are working in the Democratic Party now have an illusion that somehow they can take over the Democratic Party, and they've got to stay in the Democratic Party a long time in order to be able to accomplish that. I believe that would be a disaster. And some of the critics of what I'm saying are concerned about that also. So there's a discussion, a critical discussion. Some of the criticisms, I think, tend to be dogmatic or sectarian, and some of them are coming from a place that I think is serious and worth considering and discussing further. The main thing is we've got to be engaged in action, in activism. We've got to be testing things out. When we take a look at some of the comrades, Lenin in Russia or Trotsky in certain contexts, shocked their more orthodox Marxist comrades by grabbing hold of new opportunities that seemed to go in a direction that was not consistent with the old Marxist dogmas. And sometimes you have to do that in order to win things that can't be won otherwise in the new situation. You have to be ready to take risks. You have to be ready to possibly make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. But sometimes they're not mistakes, and you learn from that also. That's the kind of fluid and exciting situation I think that we're in today. So that's tactics for the present time.
In terms of the criticisms of Bernie Sanders, it's true that he frames socialism fairly much in the terms of a welfare state, and I think you and I both conceive of socialism in a much broader context than that.
So I want to talk about limitations and serious limitations that I see with Sanders. And there are similar limitations one can discuss with some of the other candidates, but Sanders is in the forefront at the moment. And I've talked about some of the things that I see that are positive. I think that you alluded to in your comment is that it's not a definition of socialism. Sometimes he's talking about a social democratic welfare state that exists in, or that he believes exists in Denmark or Sweden or Norway. And sometimes he's talking about Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal policies. And it's important to recognize that in Scandinavia, in the Scandinavian countries, you have capitalism, you do not have socialism. I've talked to socialist comrades in those countries, and they say, no, we have capitalism. This is not socialism. There are good welfare state reforms that the labor movement fought for and won, but that's not socialism. There's still capitalism, and it is undermining the gains that we made. Franklin D. Roosevelt was very clear. He was in favor of capitalism, and he was helping to implement New Deal reforms and welfare state type reforms in order to save capitalism. And I think it's a mistake for Sanders sometimes to slip into that kind of rhetoric and that kind of glorification of those things. He has a model. One of his heroes, or at least he says he's one of his heroes, who beautifully was able to talk to masses of American workers in a very persuasive way about what socialism really is, Eugene Victor Debs. And it is essential that socialists put forward the Debs message of socialism, in which each and every person can live a decent life, and we all have a say in the decisions that affect our lives and affect our society, not just politically, but especially in terms of the economy. So that is one limitation of Sanders. Another limitation, and it may be related to this, is that in regard to foreign policy, he has not put forward a consistent understanding of U.S. foreign policy as representing the interests of the capitalist class, of the multinational corporations, at the expense of the American people and at the expense of peoples all over the world. And that U.S. foreign policy has been designed traditionally and still is designed to meet the interests of U.S. multinational corporations at the expense of the majority of people of the world. And it is essential that socialists make that clear and talk about that in a very serious way. And to the extent that Sanders fails to do that, to the extent that Sanders sometimes does the opposite, it is essential to criticize him, not to denounce him in ways where his supporters won't understand what we're talking about, but rather to explain it in terms where his supporters will understand what we're talking about. And the model, one of the great models for this, was Eugene Victor Debs. It can be done. It can be put into the language of the American working class so that people understand it and get it. So these are limitations of Sanders and some of the others. Hopefully they'll overcome those limitations, but if they don't, we've got to overcome those limitations as we're building the mass socialist movement that we need to advance the interests of the American working class majority.
Well, that's perhaps a hopeful point to end. I think, as you have pointed out a number of times, the question of socialism in the United States is much bigger than just Bernie Sanders or AOC, and there is, I think the source of hope is a vibrant renewal of the socialist movement, which we have been which we have been seeing. And I'd like to thank you for joining us today to discuss to discuss these developments in US politics.